A lot of these things because they're fun, and half the fun, or a good part of the fun, is putting them together and learning all the stuff that it takes to put them, that you learn while you put them together. The show, not much about, I retired from Louisville Gas Electric. We were talking to somebody about streetcar tracks in the streets earlier. We used to run into those things all the time. And the other thing was that I retired from the Army Reserve currently. And so between it all, you know, and mostly I was an instructor of one sort or another in both of those fields. So anyway, it's called Rails to Valley Station because they had to come up with a name, and we are in Valley Station. However, it's really going to cover railroads in the area, probably from Shively to, let's say, West Point, just to give you a geographical area, because it's kind of hard to confine something like that in a small area. I'm going to talk first about the railroads in the area today. And one of the most prominent ones is the Paducah and Louisville Railroad, which runs from Oak Street in Louisville to Paducah. And it's, although one friend of mine says, you know, I always go out Dixie Highway and never see a train. You know, they don't run very often, but they, of course, nowadays trains are getting longer and fewer because they can haul more stuff. And Paducah and Louisville has a lot of different things that run, but a lot of them they run at night. Like they have a train that usually comes in early in the morning to Louisville and leaves out late at night. So a lot of times you're just not going to see it much on the road. Another major player in the Louisville area is CSX. And of course, this picture is taken at Cardinal Stadium, Central Avenue overpass. Some things have been changed a little bit since then. But and CSX, which I'll talk a little bit later about the L&N, passes through Louisville and actually it also terminates at Louisville. And there's two different routes that come in here. This particular train you're looking at is arriving in Louisville area and having come from Cincinnati. And the tracks you see going way off in the distance out there, that was the main line that went to Union Station. But nowadays, there are trains that utilize the railroad in Indiana that come from Louisville going to Indianapolis, taking that route up there. So I remember somebody one time said, do they have trains anymore? You know, well, you know, when you get stuck at a crossing, you suddenly realize maybe there are some here. I think people kind of got out of thinking about them. It's a busy world, plus nobody rides a train around here anymore. There's no passenger trains. So that makes a difference. And another one. Okay, well, there's no rails under that, but that, I'm looking at now successors to the original rails, and TARC is also a successor to a rail network that served this area. Of course, this is taking one of the Big Four Bridge, which was named for a railroad also. I've always been told, this is 9 Mile House, it's gone, I love it, it's long gone. I've always been told that that was a stagecoach stop. I don't know whether it was or not, but it sure looks old enough to have been one. To get from, let us say, Louisville to Nashville, there's 2 ways you could go. And they were both mail routes, U.S. postal routes. One, which we're not going to talk about now, you could go out Jefferson Street to Bardstown Road through Bardstown and eventually get down to Nashville. And then the other route was to come out this way on the Salt River Turnpike and to get to Nashville. Another thing to remember about the roads was there were no public highways. Yes?
Was this at Dixie and Greenwood?
I can't remember what, it's a 7317 Dixie Highway is where it was. So,
Pretty close.
it's north of here, but south of Dixie Manor.
I'd heard about a stagecoach stop there at Dixie and Greenwood.
It took, to go by stage to Nashville, it took 2 and or partial days to get there. And one guy was describing the trip, and they got up really early morning in the dark, found their way to the coach. The coach then went by the post office, which and picked up the mail, because it was one of the big things they did, had a mail contract. And people were all crammed in the coach, on top of the coach and everything else. And if you didn't like the person next to you, tough, because they were going to be elbowing you and everything, and belching and all the other stuff all the way. And like I said, and you had to change horses frequently. People had to get out. When you got to Salt River, they had to put it on a float or a barge, a ferry, whatever you want to call it, get it across Salt River, get it back up at West Point again, and head on south. So they said it took about 2 days, maybe 2.5 days to get to Nashville. And that's if you were a person that could afford it. Other people just walked to Nashville. And you can imagine, if you really had to go, that's the way you might go. But anyway, so you kind of use that as an idea of a stagecoach stop. And remember, everything, also along what we'll call Dixie Highway, that's what it is now, there was toll booths. So you had to pay a toll ever so often. And it was sort of like the modern tollway, so much for a pedestrian, back then, so much for a horse, so much for a wagon, and I'm sure the stagecoach had its own rates that it had to pay. So travel was not that easy to go between cities. This is a map. The map dates from 1879, but I'm talking about the railroad here. In 1874, the Elizabethtown to Paducah Railroad, actually before that, they ran a railroad from Elizabethtown to Paducah. Okay, wait a minute, there's a city north of there, Louisville. Maybe we ought to go there. So they ran a branch line from Cecilia, Kentucky to Oak Street, and that was called the Cecilia Branch. And anyway, this is a map of Valley Station in 1879. The one thing I've never been able to figure out is, where was the depot? I'm thinking the depot was south of Valley Station Road along the railroad tracks, coming in off Dixie Highway. That's where I think the depot was. There was also a store there, and the store could have been the depot. That could have worked too. The other thing that's very vaguely shown here for people in the area is Deering Road. They don't show the whole road, but I'm sure that this thing, it went all the way back out to Dixie Highway, because that's why it was there. It was called Stump Alley, and it bypassed the toll house, which you see the toll house right there. It bypassed that toll house. The farmers built it to get free, to bypass that toll house. And it just, I always say too, the church, where it says church under, right up here above the Thomas Estate, that was the forerunner of Bethany, United Methodist Church. They moved from there over on the Dixie Highway, and Bethany was named then eventually later on. But anyway, that was, and that part of off Deering Road is called Church Lane. But anyway, so that's kind of what you had in the area. Well, some things changed. First of all, kind of get how he came into the picture, was the Louisville and Nashville Railroad bought the Cecilia branch of Paducah, or the Elizabethtown and Paducah. The reason why was they could have a parallel track to run more traffic up Muldrow Hill. So you know where the L&N or CSX is there on I-65, heading towards Shepherdsville, and you're going up Muldrow Hill and all that. Anyway, they could double the trackage, basically. However, that was against the law. You could not have parallel railroads in the state. And I've always heard that Bennett Young, who hated the L&N Railroad, was a big developer, he took them to court. And And so the L&N suddenly had to do something with it. Well, along comes Mr. Collis P. Huntington. Remember, he had been influential in building the Transcontinental Railroad, and which was the Central Pacific at his end from California, which was not quite transcontinental. It only went to Omaha, and it made with other railroads at Omaha. But Mr. Huntington comes back, and now he's going to have a real transcontinental railroad. It's going to run from Newport News, Virginia to Los Angeles, California. And it's all going to be under one ownership. And so he started putting together a bunch of, and you can see I always like the hyperbole of the newspapers of the day, but Huntington closing up the gap in his line. Well, the gap in Louisville specifically was the trestle went across the riverfront. He needed that to tie it all in. But he also needed the Elizabethtown and Paducah, so he leased it from the L&N. And that kind of took care of their problem. And at the same time, it said rumored agreement of the L&N officials for the use of the Cecilia branch, which they did. And you sit there and you say, well, whatever happened? I've never heard of this Transcontinental Railroad. Well, it went bankrupt. And it got sold off. It still had a presence in Louisville if you knew what you were looking at until 1982, because the Chesapeake and Ohio, which was the eastern end of Kentucky, this railroad, because he called it the Chesapeake, Ohio, and Southwestern. So it came in from Lexington, from Ashland to Lexington and then into Louisville, and the railroad that eventually bought him out, and they exchanged cars downtown. And that trestle across the riverfront, they still tied themselves together with that. But it all changed when CSX came along. Okay, the big change, let me look at my cheat sheet. I'm not trying to memorize all of these dates. Dates are nice, but they're not the best. Okay. In 1897, after several bankruptcies, he sold it to the Illinois Central Railroad, and it became the Kentucky branch of the Illinois Central. This particular picture is taken at in Shively, just west of Berry Boulevard. If you went straight on Berry, at that time you would have pretty much run into this train. But,
I grew up right there. I grew up just across. See that little white garage there? That's where I grew up.
Okay. Yeah, because that, and the spur track there went to a tobacco warehouse that was over on behind Berry Boulevard.
Right.
But anyway.
The tobacco warehouse burnt in 1969.
Oh, really? Well, yeah, Arlen's department store.
Arlen's.
Yeah. The thing that Illinois Central was one of the last ones in the area that still use steam. Everybody else has gone to diesel. Illinois Central will continue with steam. And if you look closely, you know what you're looking at. The car behind the engine's a tender. That contains the coal and the water, because it's steam. The square car behind the tender is the water tank. They had additional water so they wouldn't have to stop very often for water. The biggest thing that steam engines had to stop for was water more than fuel. And so anyway, like I said, they ran kind of the last trains in the area by steam. I just like this picture. It's a good one. This is a Illinois Central switch engine. They're switching at the distillery at Watson Lane. Remember where Watson Lane is? That's at Watson Lane. Some of the buildings are still there, so you kind of recognize it. And to the right out of the picture was the cigarettes distillery. So there are several distilleries right in that area. They terminated at Oak Street. This is taken back in the 1920s. This is the Illinois Central yards at Oak Street. Somebody comment one thing, there was no 14th and Oak. Well, there is. Those cars are in 14th Street. They just closed off the street, and the railroads took it over. There was lawsuits over that in later years, but the railroads won. But anyway, they built a large roundhouse, Huntington's people had a roundhouse on the property, it wasn't that big. They built the roundhouse, and you're not familiar with what a roundhouse is. You can see it's a half-round building. The turntable in the center, they could put an engine on that, and then they could line it up with different tracks at different stalls and run the engine into the roundhouse, or turn the engine around to get it turned to go the other way. Diesel engines don't have that problem so much because they usually connect them back to back. Steam engines have to be turned. There was also other things there. There's stock pens, because you had cattle, you had to bring the cattle, you had to get them off, you had to exercise them, and all this other stuff, laws. And also it had ice house, because you had refrigerator cars, and they'd have to be iced periodically along the route. So it's hard to see. Up there's the stock pen, just beside the turntable, and back over here was the ice houses and that. And then they also had to get rid of ash and everything else. So that was, this Illinois Central had a pretty good operation there. The Paducah Louisville Railroad is still there. The roundhouse and all that's gone. This is an Illinois Central train or locomotive in Armsby Avenue. It's at 13th and Armsby, I believe is where that is. The building in the background, which always looked like a castle, that was Bingo Company, and it was torn down a few years back. But that was always a neat looking building. One of those buildings is gone one day. And Illinois Central used this track to connect with the L&N. The L&N used this track to switch the big grain elevator at 15th and Oak. Okay, the track actually belongs to the L&N. The Illinois Central, earlier the C&O Southwestern, and then the Illinois Central had their terminal at 7th Street Depot. This station depot has a lot of names. It's called 7th Street Depot. When it was first built, it was called Union Depot. Then it was called 7th Street Depot, then Central Station, and then, but most people still call it 7th Street Depot. And, but anyway, it also went through a very sorry history in a way. The original building was wooden. It burned down. They rebuilt it with a brick building. It was really doing good until 1890. It was destroyed by a tornado. So they came back, rebuilt it again, and periodically it would be flooded. Then it burned again, and then in the early 1940s they took the tower down. Then they took 2 stories off of it, and then the railroad moved out and became Actors Theater for a while. And then when I-64 was built, it went right through it. So they kind of ended the sort of bad story of Central Station. The trestle downtown, Illinois Central Gulf is just another, when they merged with Gulf Mobile in Ohio, and so they became Illinois Central Gulf for a while. And this is downtown. You see the Belknap's buildings in the background, which I think is down one of the Humana headquarters building, or Humana. And they would come down there every night and deliver cars from Preston Street to what would be the New York Central, which would take them across the river to Jeffersonville. And every night they had a standing order at Kingfish, and a guy said they would lower a bucket down, and somebody with Kingfish come out, fill their order, bring the bucket back up, put it up in the engine, and then go down and eat. Anybody, I don't really have a quiz. Anybody know where this picture was taken at? I'll give you a little hint. The little metal building's still there. This is at Blanton Lane Railroad Crossing looking south. And this, people usually have a garden there than used to. I don't think
Oh, yeah,
this year. And this is an Illinois Central, I'm pretty sure a Derby train, the Derby special coming in. I think by the time this picture was taken, passenger service had ceased. But they had quite colorful trains. Their passenger trains were originally their diesels were black and then that black cream. Another railroad that came through the area was the Louisville, St. Louis, and Texas Railroad. This picture, by the way, was taken at Falls of Rough at Rough River. But anyway, it started in West Point, building its way westward towards Henderson, Kentucky. I have the date. It was in the 1890s anyway. 1888, they completed it from West Point to Owensboro, and then they went on. And like I said, the original name was the Louisville, St. Louis, and Texas. And as the president of the company said, didn't start from Louisville, never reached St. Louis, and had no intention of going to Texas. And that was Mr. McCracken was the president of the company. Well, it went through several bankruptcies like they did in those days, and it became the Louisville, Henderson, and St. Louis Railroad. However, until just recently, on CSX, they still called that line the Texas. And now it's, but we'll get a little more detail. This was the depot they had at Howard, which is really at West Point when you get right down to it. And I'm pretty sure this depot was probably built around 1905, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But anyway, this was the Texas depot at Howard. You go there now, there's no clue that there were anything like that there. And what happened was, the original railroad, instead of built from West Point to Henderson, they started up at the top of that red line. They connected to, at that time, the Illinois Central, ran a little, not quite crazy like that, but they ran down to Howard, and then they went on to Henderson. In 1905, which you look at, they built a track from down there, you can barely see it, goes under Dixie Highway to Strawberry Yard. And that's why they had to build the depot at Howard. And the reason why was because until then, they had used the West Point depot of the Illinois Central. So since they'd already bypassed it, they could no longer use it. Before that time, they shared the track between West Point and Louisville with the Illinois Central, and they actually used a depot at 7th Street Depot at 7th River. And I got to check out and said, surely there's got to be accidents. Well, I found several, but I thought this one was they had a head-on collision between Louisville, Henderson, St. Louis, and Illinois Central. I don't know exactly where it was. It said at Pleasure Ridge Park. The track is just like it is today with single track, but there was a passing siding at Pleasure Ridge Park. In fact, a little remnant ended up there until the 1990s when there was a train wreck there, and they finally took it out. So that was the end of it. But anyway, what I can figure out is the Illinois Central train northbound is making up time. That's never a good thing when they're making up time. And so they apparently ran through the signal and everything and ran head on into the Texas train. Now, I'm sure it was a much more lightly built train than the Illinois Central train was. And it never gave an engine number, but this was a typical Louisville, Henderson, and St. Louis passenger engine of the time. They had bigger engines later, but that of the time, that was pretty close. And anyway, it said this postal clerk was hurt very seriously. Well, these had wooden coaches. So the post office car, because they sorted mail, on the car, plus it also had mail that we delivered all along the route, he was in the front. So probably the car telescoped into the tender, and in other words, it kind of crashed right through, the tender went through it, and he was seriously injured. I have no idea what actually happened to him, but there were several accidents like that along the route. There again, they used the depot downtown. This is a later picture from the colored postcard picture I showed you earlier, but you can still see we're still in the horse and buggy and early automobile days in this particular picture. And so the Normandy Hotel was over there on the other side. It's still there. When they were redoing, I had to go down the basement of the Normandy Hotel one time because we had to find out how much gas they were using. So I had to go down there and look at the plates on the equipment and see what it was. So I don't know what's in there now, but anyway, it was totally redone. This is the crossing now. When they said they went to Strawberry, they had to cross the Illinois Central. And this is underneath the Dixie Highway overpass. That's why you never see it. Now, they just rebuilt the overpass, but it's pretty much still, just wider, but still pretty much the same idea. And like I said, this is a CSX train from Owensboro heading into Osborne Yard, which replaced Strawberry. And kind of give you a good idea of, so when they went under there, all these signals would interlock. So if a train was cleared to go one way, you could not clear a train to go the other way. The signals were all interlocked. And at that time, this was all controlled out of Jacksonville, Florida.
For about 5 years, they had a four-way stop.
Do what?
They had a four-way stop there.
Well, they didn't have that. They just went on through. Because, you know,
They had to send the guy, the boots up the track about half a mile, a little, and then they would count. That box was out.
yeah, oh, okay. They used to bring a train in from Brandenburg area to go to the Riverport. I don't think they do that anymore. But anyway, this is the Evansville division of the L&N, and here is an L&N passenger train. It's passing, coming into South Louisville from Central Station, or Union Station, excuse me. It's an L&N locomotive. I can tell because it's got 3-digit numbers on it. The Texas engines, even when they were taken over by L&N, was at 2-digit numbers. And behind the locomotive, there's a post office baggage car, and then coaches. I presume it was the coaches back there behind it. This is the evening train to Evansville. This train, by the way, people want to follow the route, came out across New Cut Road, across what's there, the outer loop wasn't there then, crosses Manslip Road, on 3rd Street Road there, and then when you got to Dixie, it followed the curve there, stayed on the east side of Dixie Highway until it got to West Point. Then at West Point, went the other way, yeah. At Strawberry, so Strawberry Yard, Osborne Yard replaced Strawberry. Well, what happened to Strawberry? It's gone. But the intersection there, which is just south of Strawberry Lane on the railroad, was called SW, actually the telegraph code for the tower. And it had an interlocking system. In other words, the people in the tower had these levers where they could change the switches between the two routes. And when they did that, that would set the signals and lock it out so you couldn't do it the other way. Then there was a timer on it that when the train went through, they had to be timed out before they could change it back again, because they didn't want somebody just suddenly changing the thing. So the tower operator did that. Well, as they say, at CTC as Central Traffic Control, and they set up a CTC board at Union Station. And from then on, that was all handled at Union Station. Now, I haven't checked lately, but for many years, that's been handled out of Jacksonville, Florida. So, because modern communications, you don't need all. That's why the tower came down then. And so each time things have changed. This is the Union facilities at Central Avenue. This is the roundhouse at Central Avenue to kind of orient yourself. If you look over the top of the roundhouse, you can see Holy Name Church in the background, and way on the other side of it will be Churchill Downs. The turntable, of course, turned the engines, and you can't really see it, but one of the engines back over the roundhouse only has 2-digit number. That means it's a former Texas locomotive, but they never changed the numbers when they took it. In the 1930s, L&N had controlled this forever. They actually took it over. They absorbed the Louisville, Henderson, and St. Louis. But, you know, and the L&N had roundhouses like this all over the system, as you can imagine. And L&N was not one of the largest railroads in the country, so you can imagine what they had.
You said that was at Central Avenue?
Do what?
What's there now?
What's there now?
Football stadium.
Well, football stadium, everything's been redone there. Remember where I showed you where the train was coming around the curve at the very beginning of the program? That's pretty much where the roundhouse was. And for years, they still called it the roundhouse crossovers. But the stadium's actually built on the shops building, where at one point even built their own locomotives. This is Union Station at 10th and Broadway in the 1920s. You can kind of, this Henderson route, or the Louisville Henderson and St. Louis terminated there. And at that time it served the Pennsylvania, L&N owned it, but it served the Monon Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Louisville Henderson and St. Louis Railroad. In my opinion, it never really became a Union station until 1963, when the Chesapeake and Ohio moved out of Central Station and moved over here. From then on, every passenger train came in here. But more passenger trains, more railroads came into Central Station than came into Union Station. But L&N got the same thing. Someday I'll do a railroad history. Anyway, now let's talk about the other rail system that was here. The Louisville interurban system. This is an overall map of the Louisville interurban system. They started around 1905, close enough for government work, as we used to say. And you can see the routes that kind of went out like a spider. The routes to LaGrange and Shelbyville were originally the Louisville and Eastern Railroad. And they were based, actually their headquarters was in Anchorage, but they, I think their headquarters building's been moved, and now is a Village Anchor restaurant. But anyway, they were there, but they had terminal downtown, and an old house that they converted to a terminal. Louisville and interurban eventually took all these over with. So you could ride in 1921, we'll just pick a date. You could ride an electric railway to LaGrange, Shelbyville, Jefferson County, Fern Creek, Okolona, or Rail. And Prospect. Let us not forget Prospect. Because Prospect was actually the granddaddy of them all, because it was a steam railroad originally. So, and then northward was at this time this map was made with Louisville Northern Railway and Lighting Company, which you could board an electric car and go to Indianapolis. And then also there was a connection between New Albany and Louisville. Coming out here, well, this is their terminal downtown. This was on between Liberty and Jefferson and 3rd and 4th. And now that what's called Louisville International Convention Center, they tore it all down. They tore all this down to build that convention center downtown. This is in Indiana interurban on its way to Indianapolis coming out of the terminal. They come in the terminal from one end and back out the other. TARC finally had to move out of it. I think it lasted until just the very beginning when TARC took it over, and then they moved out because it got bought out. This is an rail car on Preston Highway, Clark's Lane. Interurban cars traditionally, they ran all over the country, Canada, and everywhere else. And there were systems in most major areas. They were usually heavier than these cars. If you went to LaGrange or Shelbyville, you would have been in a much larger, heavier car. But these worked for the Louisville interurban, mostly within Jefferson County and going to Prospect. And one way you could tell that an interurban car was coming, because it had a cowcatcher on the front. If nothing else, it was a different color too, and it had a cowcatcher on the front. A little bit more detailed map showing some of the stops. You would have left the terminal downtown. You would go to St. Helens, which which is now Chapley, and Stars Grove, which was a picnic ground. Stars Lane, I believe, is there now. Hunter's Trace, and then Pleasure Ridge, Johnsontown, Valley, Bethany, and it ended at Orrell. There was a wonderful idea to continue this at least as far as West Point. And I have seen some drawings showing a proposed route, but they never did it. It stopped. It ended at Orrell, and that's what it ended. What was the difference and how did you ride them? If you notice, they first built the Valley Station before they got to Orrell. And you notice that no city passengers carried. What that means is, now, the way the cars went to Okolona line was put in about a year later, is the cars shuttled back and forth between Okolona and Orrell. One end of the car had a sign that said Orrell, the other end of the car had a sign that said Okolona, and the motorman would just walk from the other end of the car, put his operating handle back on and running. And but once you got past into the city limits, you could not get on or off the car. It stopped. It did not. You had to go to the interurban station downtown before you could board the car or get off the car. No local passengers. The same way, you boarded the car to go to Orrell until you got south of Algonquin Parkway and left the city. You didn't get on or off the car. It did not pick up or discharge passengers from there on. Not a great picture, but this is a picture taken in Okolona with a whole gang of cars there at Okolona for some strange reason. And that's an Orrell car getting ready to leave and get on the way. Picture of an Orrell car at the shops at Brook Street. The little interurban, there were two interurban operations that had shops and freight houses around Brook Street. And that whole area now has all been taken over by the ranch or the interstate. But that was at the shops there. And again, you can kind of get a little detail of the cowcatcher on the front. And they were all 900 series cars. And I believe they're all made by the St. Louis Car Company. Not a great picture, but you take what you get. This is at Hunter's Trace. To the left over there, you see a little black thing. That's the shelter. That's your station at Hunter's Trace. If you need to pay your fare, the conductor on the car would take your money, or you need to get off. Like everything else, the building across the street was torn down a few years ago for a Walgreens. So, pretty Walgreens nowadays. But anyway, back then, that was the one Hunter's Trace. When they built the big sewer for the southwestern outfall, which went across 7th Street, still does, well, under 7th Street crossways, they had to gap it. That sewer is as tall as this room. They always show pictures of a locomotive going through it. But it's easily as tall as this room. And so they had to open cut it. And so they put a little bridge thing, a wooden bridge. They stationed a car south of there. So you would catch the car, let's say at Hunter's Trace. When you got up to 7th Street Road there, by the warehouses and all, by the, well, there's a city, there was a garden, community garden on the property, part of the sewer easement now. But anyway, then you would get off the car, cross the bridge, and a car would be waiting for you on the other side. I can imagine that cost. I have a feeling that hurt traffic-wise over the years. Now, because of the extensive rail network serving this area, it became popular with the U.S. Army, and in 1903 they had Camp Young at West Point, which was one of the largest maneuvers that the Army had since the Civil War. And what it basically did was take National Guard units, which had been newly formed in a way, and from most of the Midwest and the areas even around here, they converged on the West Point area and had a series of maneuvers. So the training was led by the 7th Cavalry. Yeah, same one as Custer's group. They were the active Army unit that led the thing. And a lot of things were learned in that lesson. lessons learned and everything. One was the National Guard needed a lot more training, which is understandable, because you only get to train at home without anything around, you know. And this was a grand review. I think this is probably at the end of the thing, where they had a muster formation. And what I think is interesting here, it shows the transition that the Army had in uniforms. Most of the troops you see there are in the modern khaki uniform, and the officers out front are in the blues. And a comment was made in at least one study I read that the khaki uniforms were much more effective in concealing the troops than the blue uniforms. So that was one thing. The other thing was the stripes. You see the sergeant here in front, his stripes point down. They were in transition. Now these stripes point up. I don't know what, that was the transition at just about the same time. They were building a modern army. To kind of cure some of that National Guard problem was Camp O'Rell. Now Camp O'Rell was on Blevins Gap Road just off of Dixie Highway, and it was run by the Kentucky National Guard. And it was leased land, they didn't own it, but it had rifle ranges, or at least a rifle range, areas where they could camp and do different training exercises and that. And this ran right up until almost after World War I. And one account in the newspaper was they didn't do a head count very well. They started boarding up the head to leave and realized they left some of their troops out in the woods. So they had to go back and get them. But this was a feature in the paper. It was a big deal. Camp O'Rell was. And of course that eventually led to Fort Knox. And the Army wanted Fort Knox. Property looked good to them. But Henry Watterson, among other people, talked them into taking Camp Taylor. It was an offer they couldn't refuse because Louisville put together a package that says, here's an Army post for you. And it's all here. And so the Army, but they built Camp Knox to be their artillery ranges and that sort of thing, with the idea that when Camp Taylor closed, they would move operations to Camp Knox, which eventually, as we know, we did. Now, not part of the Army, but also at Fort Knox is the Treasury Department operates the gold depository. And they started this, they started in 1936, 35-36, they built in 1937, they started bringing the gold from the East Coast here. Now, I don't recall where, this is not the only gold depository the U.S. has. I just can't remember where the other one is. It's nowhere near as famous or well known as Fort Knox. But anyway, that's what the gold depository, and they brought the trains in. These are the cars unloading the gold, and then the Army armed protected convoys that take them about a mile and a half down the river. This is still where the railroad yards and that there along Brandenburg Station Road there on Fort Knox. And the question always comes up, gosh, is there any gold in Fort Knox? Oh no. Well, we know there is because James Bond saved it all. Now, if you remember though, what Art Goldfinger was going to do was contaminate it with radioactivity from a dirty bomb and make it all worthless. Now, in the original Ian Fleming book, he had trucks set up at E-Town, and he was actually going to take the gold out of there and load it all up at E-Town. The book was a little different. And the other thing on the book was railroad-wise was James Bond, and on Goldfinger has a private train. He leaves Central Station at 7th Street. He's coming up along Dixie Highway, and somehow James Bond gets a message off to his buddy, what's his name, Felix Leitner, and they're waiting for him at Fort Knox. But the drama took place right along here is where the drama took place. No, it was on a train. What do we got today? Okay, like I said, Paducah Louisville, and this also brought along a lot of industry. Rubbertown was developed starting in 1941, and to make synthetic rubber. And it's a series of plants, each one making a component that transferred it to the other plant to where the finished product finally came out. This is a P&L train that is switching at Rubbertown and Bell's Lane. I did not show it in here because they don't come down this far. Norfolk Southern also switches there into Rubbertown, but they don't come this far. They can come to the river port, but they don't. They have rights, but they never come down. This is a P&L train, the U of L engine, the old U of L engine. They got a new one now. Passing Southland Terrace Shopping Center right at Crumbs Lane. And actually, this is a local train going to Cosmosdale Cement. I can tell that he's pulling cement cars behind it. It also has the new signals, which some people call Darth Vader signals because they look like Darth Vader's helmet. One of the major customers that developed was Little Gas Electric. First at the Patty's Run plant, then at Cane Run, and eventually at Mill Creek. This is the only one of the plants down this way that still uses coal. Patty's Run closed, was torn down years ago. They imploded at least a stack at Cane Run, and it's now a combined cycle natural gas plant. It is too old. There's no way they could have maintained that plant. Mill Creek is getting ready to retire, understand units 1 and 2. And again, it's a problem how old they are. But the other units will still continue churning away for many years to come. This is a P&L coal train with the new UK engine at Cosmosdale. But what he's actually doing, he's stringing out a coal train from Mill Creek. I'm pretty sure those are empty hoppers that are going to be on their way back to western Kentucky for a refill pretty soon. But anyway, they also, like I said, P&L also serves Cosmosdale Cement. Now, a little bit about Pleasure Ridge Park. This is a map. 1879 only means that's when the map was. You're looking at a picture, a map of Pleasure Ridge Park in 1879. I don't know, I have somewhere it got changed from Paynesville to Pleasure Ridge Park. But anyway, this is what it appeared like in 1879. And so you can't always take the roads on there as gospel because sometimes they just didn't fill the whole thing in. I've learned that. This map system was a subscription system. They would come by to your house and knock on your door and say, if you subscribe to this, we'll put your name on the map. Oh, and we'll put a picture of your house, draw your house, you pay this much money. And if the farmer said, well, I meant to always put up a fence. I don't want, well, we'll draw the fence in. Anything you want, we'll pay for it. They use college kids pushing wheelbarrows with odometers on them. And probably they were supposed to be measured, but they're really doing was selling people the map. Anyway, you see the PRP light. These lights do not work on this thing. So you see down there where it says depot. You look at round knob and go directly to your left, you'll see depot. And that's where the Pleasure Ridge Depot was. And here is a picture of the Pleasure Ridge Depot. And I'll go into a little bit on where it was. I learned about this lady at a little historical league meeting at St. Andrew Cemetery. But this is Ellen Murphy, was the station agent at PRP. Now, I won't go everything a station agent did, but obviously she sold tickets to the train. But also, if you ordered something from your Sears and Roebuck catalog, you probably picked it up from her at the station. If you wanted to order a manure spreader, it would be brought down, put on a siding, and Mrs. Murphy would have you do all the paperwork and everything. And she also collected the mail sacks that would be dropped off. So she was in charge of that station. She also operated a telegraph or later a telephone to let know when a train passed, she had to call the dispatcher and say, train such and such on station. And that meant that he could check it off to where he was. They didn't have all telemetry and stuff like that. She's the widow of Frank Murphy. Now, Mrs. Murphy was born in Gravel Switch, Kentucky, a railroad town in Marion County on the L&N. At some point, she got to Louisville. She met Frank Murphy, who was born in Ireland. He was an Irish immigrant, and they were married. And everything I can figure out, he worked for the Illinois Central Railroad. And he was killed, said, by a passenger train at Waverly, Kentucky in 1910, leaving Mrs. Murphy, a widow with 5 children, the youngest one 3 years old. So, only thing I think of is the railroad offered her this job at PRP. Now, there weren't a lot of benefits and stuff like that, but they offered, I'm pretty sure they offered her this job here at PRP, and she took it over. She died in 1963, and she's buried in St. Andrew's Cemetery up here on St. Anthony Church Road. Her son, Frank Murphy, reestablished the post office at PRP. Some of y'all might remember the little post office building. I think it's something else now. He owned a hardware store at PRP. He became the postmaster. He built that had that post office built. He was influential in starting Pleasures Park Fire Department. He was just everything that you want to think of. He was involved in everything. Of course, his mother was an important person in the town, and so was he. And where was the depot? Okay. There's the new road, the big wide road. That's the new St. Andrew's Church Road. If you look up above there, running at an angle, it's the old St. Andrew's Church Road. Okay? There's some white structures right there where the connection between the two roads. That, and maybe out in the middle of the street, is where the depot was. And those structures are on railroad property. So those are the signal, those are the called bungalows, and they're the cabinets for the operating of the railroad. The house with the white roof over here, that's Frank Murphy's house. And he died several years ago, but that was his house there. She lived across the street, maybe on this side of where that building with the red roof is. I'm guessing, because you can't match the addresses up now, because it's all been changed. So, what's going on now? Well, it's all, I think I've kind of covered what's going on. A lot less traffic, but longer trains. Still important. Rail service is still important. TARC has started with express service out here. When the interurban quit in 1935, Louisville Railway Company, which owned the company, interurban company, they sent buses out here. And I don't know how long that lasted, because then Greyhound took it over. Because I saw a big complaint in one of the newspaper articles about Greyhound didn't have enough bus service out here. And a friend of ours, she went to school, she graduated from Valley High School, but went to school at a business college downtown. She had to take the Greyhound in every day to go down there to the business school, unfortunately. In 2008, somebody, and I don't know who, came up with this beautiful idea that we could run commuter trains to Fort Knox, or maybe all the way to Elizabethtown. And how anybody could have talked the Paducah Louisville Railroad into that, because the last thing that a railroad wants is commuter trains on the railroad. But the P&L was looked as a candidate because it was the least, had the least traffic of a lot of the railroads. So they put together a special, headed up by the U of L and U of K engines, and they brought a couple of their business cars up from Paducah, and they ran this special, which they called the commuter rail inspection train. And I didn't realize, a friend of mine, he was riding on the back, and he kind of waved at me as it went across the, I didn't know he was going to be on it, you know, whatever. But obviously nothing came of it. zero, literally nothing is going to come of it. So anyway, that's kind of puts us at the end. And the end of the train is about as good as the end you get. I guess the question, if you have any questions, I will attempt to answer. Yes.
You didn't mention the Cosmosdale Depot. Cosmosdale had a depot.
Cosmosdale does, it's still there.
Yeah, it's made out of concrete,
Yeah.
and that's the reason why it's still there. So anyways, I was just
Yeah, the Cosmosdale Depot, you can't hardly see it now from Dixie Highway.